Okay, so 2 weeks ago, I delivered a message called Stinkin' Thinkin'. Last week, I delivered a message called Compost Christianity. Today's message is Bloom Where You're Planted. So do you think that there's a theme or a connection here? Probably so. At least in my twisted mind, that's the way it kind of all works out. But this time I wanted to turn to an old chapter or old book, Jeremiah, as the text of our lesson. It's Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 4 through 11. The Old Testament book of Jeremiah, chapter 29, verses 4 through 11. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you. In my name, I have not sent them, declares the Lord. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. So, authorities in California, while investigating some damage that had been done by a recent forest fire, found the body of a man in a burned out section of the forest. Astonishingly, as this picture depicts, the guy was dressed in a wetsuit, including scuba tanks, flippers, and a face mask. A post-mortem on this unfortunate individual revealed that he had not died from burns as a result of the fire, but from massive internal injuries. Understandably, investigators wanted to figure out how a scuba diver could end up dead in the middle of a forest fire. Well, after some investigation, apparently on the day of the fire, the decedent had gone for a diving trip off the coast, some 20 miles west of the forest. Meanwhile, firefighters, trying to control the blaze as quickly as possible, had called in a fleet of helicopters with huge dip buckets to dip water from the ocean and dump it onto the forest fire. Apparently, 1 minute our diver is making like flipper, and the next he's doing the breaststroke in a dip bucket 300 feet in the air. Apparently, our decedent extinguished exactly 5 feet 10 inches of the fire. And in the California Examiner, dated March 20th, 1998, the author wrote, "Some days it just doesn't pay to get out of bed." Now, I will tell you that I did some more vetting of this story. There's a site called Snopes. Some of you are probably familiar with it. Snopes says that this story is patently false, so I don't know. It was written up in a newspaper that I just mentioned to you. Snopes says it's false. But this next story I'm going to tell you is definitely true. So a man is working on his motorcycle on the patio of his house. Now, and his wife is inside the kitchen and she's making some lunch. So while racing the engine, the motorcycle accidentally slipped into gear and dragged the man through the glass patio doors, dumping him onto the floor inside the house. Hearing the crash, the wife ran into the dining room and found her husband lying on the floor. He's cut, he's bleeding, he's laying next to the motorcycle and sprawled on the shards of glass of what was once their patio doors. The wife immediately calls 911, and because they lived on a fairly large hill, she ran down the several flights of stairs from the house to meet the paramedics on the street below. So after the ambulance arrived and transported the man to the hospital, the wife righted the motorcycle and pushed it outside the house. Seeing some gas spilled on the floor of the overturned motorcycle, she got a few paper towels, blotted up the gasoline, and threw the paper towels into the toilet. Meanwhile, the man was treated and he was released from the hospital. And when he got back home, he looked at the shattered patio doors and the extensive damage that had been done to his prized motorcycle. He was depressed. So he went to the bathroom, sat down on the toilet, and smoked a cigarette. After finishing the cigarette, he flipped it between his legs into the toilet bowl, and that's when the explosion occurred. And then the screaming. The wife, hearing the commotion, found her husband lying on the floor next to the toilet. His pants had been completely blown off, and he was suffering burns on his buttocks, on the back of his legs, and his groin. So, once again, for the second time this day, the wife calls 911, and the very same paramedic crew who had earlier responded was sent back to this same residence. The paramedics loaded the husband onto the stretcher and began carrying him down the stairs to the street. And while they were going down the stairs, one of the paramedics asked the wife how her husband had burned himself. She told them what had happened, and the paramedics started laughing so hard that one of them slipped and lost his grip on the stretcher. Yes, the man fell out of the stretcher, tumbled down the remaining stairs, and suffered a broken arm. Oh, yes. What a day. What a day. Have any of you ever had a bad day? Have you ever been put in a really difficult spot? Or have you been asked to do a really difficult job that you just knew would not make you any friends? Doing the right thing is not always easy. And the prophet Jeremiah, who was the writer of the text we read this morning, knew all about that. Because this was a particularly rough period in Israel's history. Jeremiah had been sent by God at a very young age to prophesy to the people of Judah. And if you recall, Judah was the southern two tribes that had been carved away from Israel after it had been split into two kingdoms after the reign of King Solomon. So Jeremiah went to live at the capital, which was Jerusalem, and in the 13th year of the reign of good King Josiah, he began to prophesy. Now that was in 628 BC. And Josiah was bringing about tremendous reform among the people of Judah. Things were going great. The nation was turning back to God, and it was working out wonderfully until Josiah's untimely passing in 609 BC. After Josiah's death, Judah went downhill rapidly. So fast that it was making people's heads turn. So Jeremiah's job was to warn people that God was going to punish them for their disobedience, especially for their idol worship. Now, as you can imagine, Jeremiah wasn't very popular. In fact, the king and the religious leaders accused Jeremiah of spreading lies and dissent among the people. Apparently, fake news isn't new. But Jeremiah had been told by God to be vocal because the Babylonians were right outside the gates of Jerusalem and poised to overrun the nation. So when the future seemed to be just as bad as it could get, Jeremiah was prophesying doom and gloom, which you can understand was not a particularly popular message. And then finally, in 597 BC, God allowed the Babylonians to conquer the entirety of the Israel nation and cart the best and the brightest off to Babylon. And 10 years later, 587 BC, God brought the Babylonians back to completely destroy Jerusalem and take all of Judah back to Babylon. And church, that's when the message began to change. You see, God's message through the prophets was what I would say anachronistic or chronologically misplaced or out of order, sort of out of step with the times. So now, when the Israelites were at their absolute worst, God's message to them was at the peak of hope. I mean, it seems to be a little backwards. And I'm thinking, have you ever gone through a rough patch in your life and people have come up to you and said that, everything's going to turn out just fine? Although probably well-meaning, the message that you receive sometimes can be all wrong. And too often, we can give wrong messages to other people. We tell people that everything's going to be okay when they have cancer or when their father's had a heart attack or when they've lost their job or their health or even their hope. I mean, the truth is sometimes it's not okay. I mean, we need to face it that bad things happen sometimes. But God has a plan even in the midst of bad circumstances. Now, back in Jeremiah's day, there were these so-called prophets who were telling the Israelites that God was going to come back, He was going to rescue them, He's going to take them back to Jerusalem. But that was a lie. Instead, God, through Jeremiah, told them to work hard in Babylon, to invest themselves in the culture where God had allowed them to be taken, and to then wait on the Lord's salvation. In other words, He told His people to bloom where they're planted. That's what Martin Luther referred to as the doctrine of vocation. Vocation, at least it was thought in the Middle Ages, that only people who truly pleased God were priests and monks and nuns, those who were like on God's payroll, so to speak. However, Martin Luther rediscovered what Christians have known for a long time, but sometimes we forget that whatever you do, using your God-given talents and abilities as a Christian is pleasing to God. You don't have to be a minister to please God. When you are the best father, the best mother, the best son, the best daughter, the best husband, the best wife, the best friend, the best employee that God has made you to be, God is pleased. God calls you, me, all of us, to bloom where we are planted. And church, God has planted us here in these present circumstances for the time being. And no matter what station you may find yourself in life, this is where we are collectively as a church and individually you as people are here in this place at this time. And God has called you and me and all of us, where we are now, to bless the lives of the people with whom we come into contact. God tied the promise to his people to the land, to the location where his people found themselves, despite their dire circumstances. They could not see for the life of them how God was working in their lives. But they were encouraged to wait on the Lord, to trust in his providence, and to rest assured that he had a plan for their hope and for their future. And maybe you don't know how current experiences and circumstances fit into God's plan for your life. And as difficult as it may seem, the advice is to wait, to be patient. The Israelites could not see how their experiences were even close to being a good thing. They were enslaved for 70 years. But God eventually brought them back to the land, but only after that 70-year period of captivity. The land, at least it seems to me, was God's means to his end. Because centuries later, wise men from the East would come to visit the infant Jesus. And many scholars believe that these wise men were from Babylon. And who was the leader of all the wise men in Babylon? He wrote a book. His name is Daniel. And Daniel maybe was sharing the message of the coming Messiah with his counterparts and colleagues. And they then become part of the history of the Messiah, the same Jesus who came to pay for our sins through his suffering and death, so he could free us from our lives of sin through his glorious resurrection. Through Jesus Christ, church, we can always bloom where we're planted. Through him, our bad days can be turned into days of rejoicing, not because they're bad, but because God is in control and he has a plan. Not rejoicing in the fact that we're in the midst of, let's say, a pandemic, but joy in the fact that God knows us, he has plans for us, and his plans are for our hope and for our future. A future? Yes, a future. Because there's a future for those who will wait on the Lord. As the overhead says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." We have a future. There is a plan. We can have hope. Because God has a plan for us, and it's a plan to prosper us and not harm us. A plan to give us hope and a future. So my encouragement to you today, despite everything that's going on around us, bloom where you're planted. Because it beats being, let's say, a scuba diver in a forest fire, right? Bloom where you're planted. These are unusual times. They are tough times. They are stressful times. They are times that have taken loved ones from us. It's not easy living through these days. But you've come here today to worship a God who has told you that I have a plan for you, for your future, and for your hope. But characteristically for God, he took exiling his people to Babylon and then told them, have kids, have a family, plow, harvest, pray for the prosperity of your captors. Because if they succeed, you will too. And we find ourselves spending a lot of time feeling very planted at home. And a lot of us are not feeling very bloomy either. But that notwithstanding, the challenge for you is to bloom where you're planted. Because your God and my God has a plan for you, has hope for you, and has a future in store for you.